Welcome to the Going Green podcast. This has been sort of an exciting week, I suppose, for climate change. Not for the right reasons, unfortunately.
No.
We've been looking at wildfires in Canada, sending its smoke to sort of obliterate some of the United States. We've seen really hot water in the Atlantic and Pacific, get it right. And we've seen the beginnings of an El Nino. We're looking at higher temperatures in many parts of the world, colder temperatures in others. So I suppose we need to ask the question, are we approaching a tipping point? Have we reached a tipping point? Have we gone over a tipping point? What is a tipping point? And, well, is there such a thing as a tipping point? I suppose these are all the problems that we need to try and sort of look at and talk about.
Yeah, and let's begin by describing what a tipping point is. And a tipping point essentially is if you take, say, a seesaw and you push a boulder from one edge to the other. At what point do you go from it being down one side to flat to down the other? And by rolling a boulder, you can change the position of your seesaw and effectively think sort of, one side is good and one side's bad. And the answer is human society, they're the ones pushing this boulder, and basically we can move it and position it. So, and it impacts sort of whether we are going to go and roll down basically fall off the proverbial cliff with climate change, or whether we can sort of come back from it and essentially,
Yeah.
keep
Well,
going.
I'd have put it that way, really. It is, have we reached the point of no return? Can we do anything now to start putting things back? And the answer is, well, not with our current plans. At the moment, our current plans are to basically become carbon sort of neutral
Yeah, the answer is yeah,
by what, whatever, 2030, 2050.
yeah. The answer to the point is basically we're trying at the moment to stop pushing the boulder and
As fast.
as fast, or even just stop pushing the boulder at all. That's what the carbon neutral is. No more pushing versus no more falling down. The point is that if we are carbon neutral, as in we're not pushing this boulder at before we reach over the halfway mark, essentially for the climate, then essentially we can then roll back down to a nice healthy climate. However, if we're pushing a boulder and we hit net zero and we stop pushing over this tipping point or over this thing, then the climate is just going to fall down, the cliff, or roll down the further way, and we're then unable to catch it, and then we suffer the consequences basically of all the problems of climate change and all those problems. And we're saying, yeah, but we were carbon neutral. And the answer is we were too late.
And we had to be carbon negative. We had to start taking the carbon dioxide not out of the air, but we got to take the carbon dioxide out of the complete system so that we can actually reduce the amount of carbon, not that we're putting in the air, because we're putting X amount and we're only taking away a small fraction of that X. We've got to take away more than X. And we're also putting in other things into the atmosphere like methane and some other, as we've talked in other programs, chlorofluorocarbons and the hydrofluorochlorocarbons. And we're not basically getting anywhere at the moment. We need to be doing an awful lot more, and we're not. We're not really doing even enough to getting at the moment to carbon neutral. We were talking about getting to 1.5 degrees, possibly by sort of 2050 or whatever. And since we've been working on this problem, it looks like 2030 is more likely, although possibly even sooner than that.
They were saying something down from like 27, which is quite, it's not very long. It's only 4 years along anyway. Anyway, but going back to all these different these tipping points about what's the hell's happening, and scientists and climate scientists, they don't agree. That's the wrong way to put it. But it's one of those things where, because climate is such a forecasty science, it's hard to actually say, oh, we're definitely going to get, or this factor is going to get this amount of warming, or the science isn't definitive. I'm not saying, and they can only say generally, such as, let's say we lose the glacier, that puts more water into the ocean. That's fine. Therefore, sea levels rise. We can know that, and we can predict how much is going to go up. But knowing how fast the glacier's melting, that's done by the average temperature, and we go through cycles anyway because we've got winter and summer. And so it's sort of like how much heat is going to be there. Well, that depends on the weather and the atmosphere, and it's such a problem to guess. And this is where I said this is where it's all forecasting, sort of the idea of individual factors produce, actual reasonable results. And the answer is not quite like that. So the things they like to talk about basically as what is known as sort of tipping points is sort of the idea that of different ice sheets, I say collapsing, that's how they define it, as in they run away and they're melting. And they basically say how long it's going to take, what's the threshold, and all sorts of what be the impact of global temperature if let's say an ice sheet, and we're talking either the Antarctic, Greenland, or whatever one you want to talk about, and let's say that moves. Well, of course, you've got a global impact, but a regional impact as well, which is a whole different sort of point in the scenario. And so it's what is worth it. They're talking about, say, if the forests, have too much dieback, which is basically cutting down deforestation, they're unable to come back. And so their carbon absorbing potential is decreased, and therefore that means more carbon goes up. And then, of course, more carbon goes up. That makes it hotter, and then the trees start having more dieback. It's just this lovely cyclic system. And the answer is, how can we say that if, say, 50 trees goes, the temperature goes 0.1? We just can't do that math.
Well, it doesn't work like that, because we often think of global warming as being a sort of a linear thing that's happening. You emit too much carbon, and therefore the planet's thermostat goes up, proportionally. And although there is some sort of pattern there, like sort of severe drought, most things don't follow that track. In other words, if I put 10% more carbon dioxide, that doesn't equal 10% more impact into the system. So the things are generally an awful lot more complex than most people imagine, because it's this almost butterfly effect, isn't it?
Yes.
Where you have a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon somewhere, and it causes a hurricane somewhere else. Yeah, we have got those sort of things. But basically, a little bit of ice here that's now turned to water can affect a whole load of different things, and not in a linear fashion. But basically, things start going on a little by little by little, and then suddenly you get a lot.
Yeah.
And this is what we're talking about, the tipping point. So we get tiny little changes, and then we suddenly find we've got one massive. Are there then, the question, I suppose, Paul, is, are there these critical thresholds that once we cross, you can't get back to? In other words, do they lead to a potentially irreversible, catastrophic impact on the planet?
And it's one of those bizarre things. And the answer is, you would probably find, depending on who you ask, the answer is I would say yes, but at the same time, you ask what factors, and I couldn't really give you a list. The answer is, could it be this lovely big thing, which is what's currently happening, called El Nino? Is that happening? And the answer is, well, yes, except of course the oceanic or the system has been changing, going up and down all over the place in a cycle. It just happens to be, we're going into an El Nino which is essentially going up, as opposed to going down. And the answer is, have we timed it right? Or more precisely, have we timed it wrong? In that we're releasing more carbon when it's going on its upward trend, in which case then we'll see all the lovely problems. But then you ask the question of, what effect does El Nino have on things? Because, of course, if you hadn't realized, that's in the Pacific.
All right, so what is it? So if I ask you a simple question, what is the El Nino?
That, after watching a lot of information on it, I'm still not quite sure, but it's something to do with the ocean current warming by South America, right? And essentially thinking almost like your water cycle, where basically where the water evaporates causes cloud formation that then produces the world's weather, right? It works in a certain direction and in a certain place because, of course, the Earth's spinning. And so it generally forms in the sort of spinning direction of the Earth, as in it moving that way around. El Nino basically is a reversal of that trend or direction. And so basically it's the warm water basically going and flowing back from South America, where it usually gets dumped, and it's actually now flowing back into the Pacific.
Yep.
Of course, then where the weather cycle then takes over, and then suddenly you've got this hot water where it technically shouldn't be, causing all this weather.
And it does happen regularly over a period of years, doesn't it? We get cold water and we get warm water. But something that's interesting at the moment is if you look at the surface seawater anomalies, we're actually seeing how the temperature of the seawater at the moment is not rising above the normal maximum minimum, but way above any other maxima we've ever had.
Yeah.
And so the water in the sea is already much warmer than it's ever been. And then if you want to try and add some more hot water from Peru, well, we're now going into what we call uncharted territory because we've never seen this before. So we don't know what's going to happen. Is this a tipping point?
Yeah, and the answer is we don't know. Is it going to cause more rain? Is it going to cause more drought? Is it going to make it everywhere sunnier? We just don't know. And this is the whole point, that because we're having all these things, climate change is essentially accelerating. That we're sort of we're pushed a little bit, and suddenly it's actually rolling out. But many people believe that, well, aren't these tipping points, sort of, as in these thresholds of things, a bit vague and a bit random, that we just made them up?
Well, I was talking to my students about what patterns are actually happening. And there are different scenarios that if we get global warming, the UK could actually get cooler. And they're going, no, that doesn't make sense. No, if it's global warming, everywhere is getting hot. And the answer is, well, not quite, because if some of the Arctic seawater melts, it's going to push the North Atlantic drift lower. And so the UK will be in colder water. And so instead of having this lovely maritime climate that we have, where we're warmer than we should be for our sort of latitude, we're then looking at us being a little bit colder, or more what we should be for our latitude.
Yes.
And that confuses them, yes.
Yeah, and it is this, it's hard to actually understand sort of what things are happening in regards to whether it's a positive or negative. And the future forecasting of what do you mean? This idea of, is it a tipping point? Are we breached it? And that what the effects are going to be? Can we predict what these effects are? And that's the struggle in all this, is regarding saying that, well, if things go up, are we going to go up? And the answer is some places are actually going to go down. And the answer is, well, in which case then how does that affect them? If some place is colder, well then, here in the maritime is going to be back to what we should be. Well, then think of how many of the insects that rely on temperature have a problem. That affects all the wildlife going forward in sort of the UK. And suddenly you've got a problem that way. You're affecting the whole food chain. You can see sort of the snowball effect in that regards to, if we're colder than usual, what that leads. But it's not just one snowball. It's sort of almost like a snowball field, sort of everybody's trying to push their own little boulder down, and basically the answer is everybody's trying to make sure theirs doesn't hit the end, because that basically makes everybody's.
Well, I liked your seesaw analogy of thinking we're pushing a boulder up, but let's think of this working slightly differently. Let's consider a much bigger seesaw, and every country is pushing their own boulder up. And some of them are pushing big boulders and some are pushing small boulders. Some are pushing quickly and some are pushing slowly. But unfortunately, they are all pushing. And although some may be slowing down, others are speeding up. And it only takes one of those boulders to go over a threshold, and then we reach a tipping point. And it might only be a very small boulder that's going to change the balance, but one of them is going to do that. And therein lies some of our problems. We're looking at lots of little changes as well as massive changes. Each of these massive changes is in fact just a little change. We notice, oh, this glacier is a little bit further back than it was last year. Okay, so it's a few foot less, but it's not that one. It's because it's all the different ones in all different places, all doing the same sort of thing. And this is why we are seeing global warming, and we are seeing things that will work in one country affecting the other. I remember watching the weather forecast only a few weeks ago, and we're looking at the sort of weather in the UK, and the weatherman just goes and says, "Yeah, but look, let's go round and have a look the other side of the world, and could this effect affect us?" And it was, could it? It's not. It's going to, because that's not the way that weather works. But weather is often sort of one of these things we can sort of get better at predicting, and we can say that, oh, if this happens, then this is more likely to happen than that. And this is where weather and climate also cause interesting things. Weather's going to be, what's it going to be like a bit later today? Whereas climate is more sort of, well, what do you think it's probably going to be like?
Yeah, or they're asking what was the temperature back then to then be able to predict the future. It is this whole, not answer of what is climate change. That's not what point, but it's the answer is, it's looking at the trends and forecasting and all these sorts of things, being able to say, not with certainty, but generally, we can measure getting warmer. Therefore, what's the consequences of things getting warmer? Or it's only getting warmer here in this specific spot. What's that going to do to the rest of the system? You've got to look at how all these weather forecasting works, and it's taking in all sorts of information from everywhere. Sort of, different points and data sets and all sorts of lots of maths and algorithms. But it's basically, they sort of say, not if they change one thing, but what if they change all of them? What does that change? And the answer, you can look at sort of, they look at sort of, if everything goes up by one, what does that show? But they can't say If you just increase this, like a sort of a mix of this, one value, is that the overall the one that basically is the defining one, the limit or the determining factor? And the answer is they cannot at the moment find what is a determinant
Yeah,
factor for
yeah,
causing climate change in regards to it's basically is a little bit of everything is causing the issue, and basically we need to turn everything down, and that's the struggle, because of course we're only being able to turn one thing down. We can't but aren't managing to turn all of them down.
yeah. And we're only turning it down by a little bit. We ought to be turning it off, or sort of doing something to sort of completely move it in the opposite direction. If we could start sucking some of this sort of carbon dioxide out of the air more than we're all putting in, then going really carbon negative, then have we still reached a point where we can't do anything if we do that? And the answer is, well, the Earth moves in different cycles. Our weather has been going in many different cycles. There are short-term cycles, there are long-term cycles. The Earth has been hotter in the past. It's been a lot colder in the past. And we can only see just really the very recent history. We can't see that, we may have had ice ages several, well, even a billion years ago. We've got no data on any of that. We can't see any of that. And so therein lies a problem, that we haven't got enough information to try and model some of these things on. So are we looking at a cycle that's we're just helping along a little bit, or are we in a cycle that we are totally man making? It's an interesting problem here. Now, let's ask a different question. Is there no tipping point, Paul? Yeah, this is a sort of an interesting question that people talk quite happily about. You know, we are reaching a tipping point, but perhaps there isn't a tipping point. Perhaps there is just this gradual moving on.
Yeah, it's one of those odd things where the answer is, if you say, a tipping point, if you talk about there's a tipping point, people say, we can claw it back. And the answer is, well, so far we have been unable to claw anything back. So perhaps the reason we can't claw it back is because we're not on an edge, because there is no edge, because of course, we're, it's not like a cliff where we jump off. It's more sort of just a continuous cycle, almost like a sort of, traveling along a long road. The answer is you either go fast along the road or slowly along the road. And the answer is we don't know whether we're going fast or slow, or we might be accelerating. The whole point where we're going from a slow to a fast. And perhaps we need to sort of stop accelerating, is the point. But the language around, so I say climate, or around all the things, is that perhaps the metaphor of a tipping point in when we talk about climate, maybe that's the wrong thing we're talking about. Maybe it's the wrong language we're talking about as a way of describing the climate and what's happening to it. And so people get this wrong idea about climate, in which case then maybe it's our fault that we're saying tipping points all the time, because perhaps it's not helping the discussion, because they're saying, we can, if we only just did this, we could pull it back away from the edge of the cliff. And that sort of is a bit, positive message. I'm not saying it's not, but saying you're able to save something from death, And the answer is that's all right, but it's sort of, you know, that's saving someone just then and there. But you need to be constantly saving all the little boulders. To what point are you saving them versus becoming a dam and trying to hold them all back?
Yeah. So your dam gets fuller and fuller and fuller until a point where it breaks. Maybe we're looking at the climate not doing that. The climate will just gradually keep getting worse and worse and worse, or warmer and warmer and warmer. I do say worse because the more energy that's in a system, basically it's got to go somewhere. So we do see, if there's more energy in the system, more hot water typically in the oceans, we're seeing then more cloud, which could mean, things being cooler, we can see more rain, we can see more droughts, we can see more wildfires. So those wildfires in Canada, what do you think caused those? And almost certainly the thing that's really caused them is that the forests were actually tinder dry. And why were they? Well, because there wasn't so much rain.
And the answer is why there wasn't much rain. And the answer is, it's the jet stream. Or there's always an excuse for things, if that makes sense. Going through, you can always say, oh, it was a jet stream not in the right place. And the answer is, that's because of all the different pressures and sort of the lack of ice that's cooling. And so, and basically, it's not the blame game. That's the wrong way to describe it. But it's the lack of saying, blaming us or blaming, there are just wildfires here, and just saying there are just wildfires, saying, the wildfires, they were caused by this and that was caused by that. And this perpetual cycle of sort of, to a point where, there are just wildfires, they need to be dealt with as quickly as possible, and perhaps we need to change the way we deal with wildfires, or even look at sort of wildfires as a way of sort of, shocking people to do something.
Well, yeah, that's possibly the reason why we could have a tipping point. When people talk about tipping points, it goes into people's ideas about a tipping point. If we do any more, it's suddenly going to get worse. So therefore, I better do something about it. Whereas possibly it's only going to get gradually worse. But it's a problem that not one thing's gradually getting worse. It's the fact that lots of things are gradually getting worse. Whether there is a tipping point and whether we're going to reach it, and it's only people's guess what a tipping point is and what it's going to do. They can only look at certain sort of computer models to see what's going to happen. But I think what we're seeing is not really at the moment a tipping point here or a tipping point coming. This is just gradual change. And we're having to start to basically live with this gradual change. We are now moving into a different type of climate than we were used to. So if you live in place X, you can now expect to have far more wildfires. If you live in place Y, you can assume you're going to get higher winds.
Or more drought.
Or wherever it's going to be, yeah. And all these things are going to change, and they are changing slowly, but they are basically changing and they can't be put back. So people talk about those lovely days years ago when this, that, and the other, well, they're gone. What we've got is what we've got now, and we have to accept that we can't change that. All we can do is possibly slow things down. And because we're not prepared to invest the money and people don't have enough will to do something, they are not going to find that sort of we're going to get anywhere. We're just seeing these changes happen slowly. And if you live in a place, you're going to have to expect now more weather.
Yes.
It's not good, is it?
No.
So, tipping points. Are there tipping points or are there not? We don't know. Nor does anybody else. We assume there are some tipping points, and all we can notice at the moment is we're approaching these things faster and faster than ever, wherever those tipping points are going to be. For many things, we've already reached the point of no return. And so, welcome to global warming.
Well, I was going to say, welcome to uncharted waters,
And yeah, definitely uncharted waters. You've been listening to the Going Green podcast. Hopefully next week we'll be back with more good news on the various items. We do try and find good, happy items. It's just global warming doesn't tend to sort of bring many happy events to us.
No.
So until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.